Okay, today we're going to talk about the growth of the nation, 1800 to 1850, and we're going to start off with Thomas Jefferson and the Jeffersonian Era. In the last unit, we did talk about Thomas Jefferson, and some of you listened to a presidential podcast about him. We talked about his complicated nature and the complicated background, historical background, and historical context in which he led. But today, we're going to talk about that in more detail. So the Jeffersonian Era. The election of 1800 pitted Thomas Jefferson, who was the leader of the Democratic Republicans, which was sometimes shortened during that time period to just Republicans, against President John Adams and his Federalist Party. Now, what's kind of interesting to know now is that what they referred to as Republicans then matches most closely with Democrats today. And you guys will see that revealed to yourself as we continue on today. So the Republicans of 1800 are much like the Democrats of today. So he was running against John Adams and his Federalist Party, and that Federalist Party matches more closely with what we would consider Republicans today. It was a really hard-fought struggle. Each party hurled wild charges at the other. The Democratic Republicans called Adams a tool of the rich who wanted to turn the executive branch into a British-style monarchy, and the Federalists protested that Jefferson was a dangerous supporter of a revolutionary France and an atheist. Oh no. In the balloting in the Electoral College, Jefferson defeated Adams by 8 electoral votes. However, since Jefferson's running mate, Aaron Burr, received the same number of votes as Jefferson, the House of Representatives was called upon to break the tie and choose between the two running mates. For 6 feverish days, the House took one ballot after another, 35 ballots finally in all. And finally, Alexander Hamilton, who just keeps coming back into this equation, doesn't he? Alexander Hamilton intervened, and although Hamilton opposed Jefferson's philosophy of government, he regarded Burr as unqualified for the presidency. In fact, he hated Aaron Burr. So Hamilton persuaded enough Federalists to cast blank votes so that Jefferson received a majority by just 2 votes, and Burr then became the vice president. The deadlock revealed a flaw in the electoral process established by the Constitution, and as a result, Congress passed the 12th Amendment of the Constitution, which called for electors to cast separate ballots for president and vice president. This system is still in effect today. In his inaugural address, Jefferson extended the hand of peace to his opponent, saying, "Every difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We are all Republicans. We're all Federalists." It's kind of nice to know that even then, elections could get contentious.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today we're going to discuss Thomas Jefferson. We're going to learn about how America became a thriving nation of small, independent farmers, eschewing manufacturing and world trade, and becoming the richest and most powerful nation in the world in the 19th century, all thanks to the vision of Thomas Jefferson, the greatest and most intellectually consistent founding father who founded the University of Virginia and grew 20 varieties of peas at Monticello.
Me from the past, get to your desk. In a stunning turn of events, me from the past is an idiot, and Jefferson is more complicated than that. So in 1800, Thomas Jefferson, pictured here. This is the 3rd time that we've featured Thomas Jefferson on the chalkboard, so we had to go a little Warhol on it. Right, so Jefferson, the Republican, ran against John Adams, the Federalist. 1800 was the first election where both parties ran candidates and actually campaigned, and surprisingly, the Federalists' elitist strategy of vote for Adams because he's better than you did not work. Now, both parties realized that it was important to coordinate their electoral strategy to make sure that the vice presidential candidate got at least one fewer electoral votes than the presidential candidate. But then the Republican elector who was supposed to throw his vote away forgot to, so there ended up being a tie between Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. As per the Constitution, the election went to the House of Representatives, where it took 36 ballots and the intervention of Alexander Hamilton before Jefferson was finally named president. Incidentally, Burr and Hamilton really disliked each other, and not in like the passive-aggressive way that politicians dislike each other these days, but in the 4 years later they would have a duel and Burr killed Hamilton kind of way. A duel which occurred, wait for it, in New Jersey. But anyway, shortly after the election of 1800, the 12th Amendment was passed, making the Electoral College simpler, but not as simple as, say, one person's vote counting as one vote. Anyway, complain about the Electoral College all you want, but without it, we would never have had President Rutherford B. Hayes, and just look at that beard! So Jefferson became president, and his election showed that Americans wanted a more democratic politics, where common people were more free to express their opinions. The Federalists were never really a threat again in presidential politics, and arguably the best thing that John Adams ever did was transfer power in an orderly and honorable way to his rival Jefferson. Jefferson's campaign slogan was Jefferson and liberty, but the liberty in question was severely limited. Only a fraction of white men were allowed to vote, and of course there was no liberty for the slaves. There's a lot of contentious debate on the subject of Jefferson and slavery, but here's my 2 cents, which I should not be allowed to contribute because we should only round to the nearest nickel, which, by the way, features Thomas Jefferson. So Thomas Jefferson was a racist, and he wrote about black people's inherent inferiority to whites and Native Americans, and the fact that he fathered children with one of his slaves doesn't change that. George Washington freed his slaves upon his death. Well, sort of. They were supposed to be freed upon his wife's death, but living in a house full of people who were waiting for you to die made Martha want to free them while she was still alive. But with few exceptions, Jefferson didn't free his slaves upon his death, and throughout his life he used the sale of slaves to finance his lavish lifestyle. And this leads to 2 big philosophical questions when it comes to history. First, if Jefferson clearly did not think that black people were the intellectual or moral equals of whites and was perfectly comfortable keeping them in bondage, then what does the most important phrase of the Declaration of Independence actually mean? And the second question is even broader. Does it matter if a person of tremendous historical importance had terrible aspects to their character? Does being a bad person diminish your accomplishments? I don't have a great answer for those questions, but I will tell you that no one remembers Richard Nixon for starting the EPA. But this is very important to understand. Slaves were aware of the concept of liberty, and they wanted it. So in addition to an election, 1800 also saw one of the first large-scale slave uprisings. Gabriel's Rebellion was organized by a Richmond, Virginia blacksmith who hoped to seize the capital, kill some of its inhabitants, and hold the rest hostage until his demands for abolition were met. But the plot was discovered before they could carry it out, and Gabriel, along with 25 other slaves, was hanged. But after the rebellion, Virginians, if they didn't know it already, were very aware that slaves wanted and expected liberty. And the response was predictable. Virginia made its laws concerning slaves much harsher. It became illegal for slaves to meet in groups on Sundays unless supervised by whites, and it became much more difficult for whites to legally free their slaves. Oh, it's time for the mystery document?
Simplifying the government. So Jefferson's theory of government, often called Jeffersonian republicanism, held that people should control the government and that a simple government best suited the needs of the people. In accordance with his beliefs, it decentralized power. Jefferson tried to shrink the government and cut costs whenever possible. He reduced the size of the army, he halted a planned expansion of the Navy, he lowered expenses for government and social functions. He also rolled back Hamilton's economic program by eliminating all internal taxes and reducing the influence of the Bank of the United States. Jefferson was the first president to take office in the new federal capital of Washington, D.C. Though in appearance the city was a primitive place, it had dirt roads, few buildings. Its location between Virginia and Maryland reflected the growing importance of the South in national politics. In fact, Jefferson and the 2 presidents who followed him, James Madison and James Monroe, all were from Virginia. This pattern of Southern dominance underscored the declining influence of both New England and the Federalists in national political life at the time. John Marshall and the Supreme Court. Just before leaving office, President Adams had tried to influence future judicial decisions by filling federal judgeships with Federalists. But the signed documents authorizing some of the appointments had not been delivered by the time Adams left office, and Jefferson argued that these appointments were invalid and ordered Madison, his Secretary of State, not to deliver them. So it's kind of interesting because we just saw conflict about appointments to the Supreme Court ahead of this presidential election. And so while we like to think that the things we're experiencing are unusual, it's not the first time that this has been a big deal, right? And it's also not the first time that people have hurled horrible insults, lashed out, been bitter and cruel to one another. And in fact, at this point in history, you're even talking about, like the video suggested, duels where people will lose their life. The signed documents authorizing some of the appointments hadn't been delivered by the time Adams left office, so Jefferson was arguing that these appointments were invalid and ordered Madison as Secretary of State not to deliver them after all. This argument led to one of the most important Supreme Court decisions of all time. It's called Marbury versus Madison. The Federalist Chief Justice John Marshall declared that part of Congress's Judiciary Act of 1789, which would have forced Madison to hand over the papers, was unconstitutional. The decision strengthened the Supreme Court by establishing the principle of judicial review, which is the ability of the Supreme Court to declare a law, in this case, an act of Congress, unconstitutional. This is a big deal because this is what is so powerful about the Supreme Court today. Finally, in 1800, Napoleon Bonaparte of France had persuaded Spain to return to France the Louisiana Territory, the land spanning from the Mississippi River west to the Rocky Mountains. France had handed this territory over to Spain in 1762 after the French and Indian War, but Napoleon planned to use it as a breadbasket for the colonial empire that he hoped to build in the West Indies one day. Many Americans were really alarmed when they heard of this transfer, as they feared that a strong French presence in North America would force the United States into an alliance with Great Britain. And you know that we had just so recently broken away and we didn't have any soft feelings toward them at this point. However, in 1803, Napoleon had abandoned his ideas of an American empire and offered to sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States. Jefferson doubted whether the Constitution actually gave him power to make such a purchase, but he decided to proceed anyway, and at a price of $15 million, the Louisiana Purchase more than doubled the size of the United States. Under the direction of the President, Jefferson, Meriwether Lewis, and William Clark organized and led a group including Patrick Gass and set off in 1804 to explore the new territory. The explorers brought back really valuable information about the West and showed that transcontinental travel was possible. This was an incredibly valuable land grab that the United States was able to take part in at that moment. Now what we're going to do for this part of the day is take a look at that Louisiana Purchase and what did we find there, what did they believe they were going to find there, and what was the value in setting Lewis and Clark off on this expedition at this moment in history.
Back to Jefferson. His idea was to make the government smaller, lower taxes, shrink the military, and make it possible for America to become a bucolic, agrarian, empire of liberty rather than an English-style industrial mercantile nightmare landscape. So how did he do? Well, really well at first. Jefferson got rid of all the taxes except for the tariff, especially the whiskey tax, and then when he woke up with a terrible cheap whiskey-induced hangover, he paid off part of the national debt, he shrunk the army and the navy, and basically made sure that America wouldn't become a centralized English-style state for at least the next 60 years. Low taxes and small government sounds great, but no navy? That would be tough, especially when we needed ships and marines to fight the Barbary pirates on the shores of Tripoli, who kept capturing our ships in the Mediterranean and enslaving their crews. This is yet another example of how foreign affairs keeps getting in the way of domestic priorities. In this case, the domestic priority of not wanting to spend money on a navy. Also, vitally, Jefferson's presidency really marks the last time in American history when a Republican president didn't want to spend money on the military. Don't get me wrong, Democrats can do it too. I'm looking at you, LBJ. As much as he wanted to get rid of any trace of the Federalists, Jefferson found himself thwarted by that eminently conservative and undemocratic institution, the Supreme Court. Jefferson appointed Republicans to most government positions, but he couldn't do anything about the Supreme Court because they served for life. And since the country was only like 12 years old, they were all still pretty fresh. Most important among them was Chief Justice John Marshall, who happened to be a Federalist. Marshall was Chief Justice basically forever, and is without question the most important figure in the history of the Supreme Court. He wrote a number of key opinions, but none was more important than the 1803 decision in Marbury versus Madison. Marbury versus Madison is so important because in that decision, the Supreme Court gave itself the power of judicial review, which allows it to uphold or invalidate federal laws. The court then extended this power to state laws in Fletcher versus Peck, and eventually even to executive action. Like, we think of the main job of the Supreme Court being to declare laws unconstitutional, but that power isn't anywhere in the Constitution itself. Marbury versus Madison gave the court that power, and without it, the Supreme Court would probably be a footnote in American history. So unlike Marshall, Jefferson and the Republicans were big proponents of strict construction, the idea that the Constitution should be read as literally as possible as a way of limiting the power of the federal government. The problem is there might be things the government wants to do that the Constitution didn't account for, like, for instance, buying a large tract of land from Napoleon, who, as we remember from Crash Course World History, complicates everything. Let's go to the thought bubble. So yeah, Jefferson basically doubled the size of the U.S. in what came to be known as the Louisiana Purchase. Napoleon was eager to sell it because the rebellion in Haiti had soured him on the whole idea of colonies, and also because he needed money. Jefferson wanted to purchase New Orleans because Western farmers were shipping their products through the city, and when he approached France about this, Napoleon was like, hey, how about I sell you this? Jefferson couldn't turn down that deal, so he bought the whole kit and caboodle for $15 million, which is worth about $250 million today. To put that into perspective, a new aircraft carrier cost about $4.5 billion, so he got a good deal. What's the problem with this? Well, nothing if you believe in a powerful government that can do stuff that's not in the Constitution, but if you're a strict constructionist like Jefferson, you have to reconcile this obviously beneficial act with there being no mention in the Constitution of the president being able to purchase land in order to expand the size of the U.S. So laying scruple aside, Jefferson bought Louisiana and then sent Lewis and Clark to explore it, which they did, even going beyond the boundaries of the purchase all the way to the Pacific. And this was so cool that it almost makes us forget that it was kind of unconstitutional and a huge power grab for the president. So the question is, why did he do it? Jefferson's desire to increase the size of the country prompted Federalists to complain that, quote, we are to give money, of which we have too little, for land, of which we already have too much. By doubling the size of the country, Jefferson could ensure that there would be enough land for every white man to have his own small farm, and this in turn would ensure that Americans would remain independent and virtuous, because only a small farmer who doesn't have to depend on the market for food or shelter or anything really, well, except slaves, can be truly independent and thus capable of participating in a nation of free men. Thanks, Thought Bubble. And this desire to create a nation of independent farmers producing only primary products helps explain Jefferson's other incredibly controversial policy, the embargo. Jefferson imposed the embargo in order to punish Britain for its practice of impressing American sailors, as well as its blockade of France, with whom Britain was once again, or possibly just still, at war. So basically, Jefferson wanted free trade among nations, and his solution was to get Congress to forbid all American ships from sailing to foreign ports. The theory was that the British were so dependent on American primary products like wood and cotton that if we cut off trade with them, the British would stop impressing American sailors and end their blockade. What's the connection connection between free trade and Jefferson's agrarian ideal? Well, the idea was that America would trade its primary products for Europe's manufactured goods so that the U.S. wouldn't have to develop any manufacturing capacity of its own. Alas, or perhaps fortunately, this did not work. For one thing, Britain and France were too busy fighting each other even to notice America's embargo, so they just continued blockading and impressing. Also, the embargo devastated the American economy. I mean, exports dropped by 80%. Furthermore, not being able to import European manufactured goods only served to spur American manufacturing. I mean, Jefferson might have wanted Americans to be a bunch of self-sufficient farmers, but Americans wanted European manufactured stuff like teapots and clocks and microwaves. Well, then how did they cook stuff, Stan? And if they couldn't get that stuff from Britain, they would just make it themselves. So in terms of Jefferson's agrarian ideal, the embargo was a massive failure. And lastly, the embargo limited the power of the federal government about as much as crystal meth limits cavities. I mean, imposing the embargo was a colossal use of federal power, and it was also an imposition on people's liberties. The problem the embargo was supposed to solve didn't go away, and as we'll discuss next week, it eventually led to the U.S.'s first declared war. For now, I want to leave you with this. Thomas Jefferson is revered and reviled in almost equal measure in American history. The Declaration of Independence, which he mainly drafted, is a signal achievement delineating some heroic ideas for the founding of the United States, but also embedding some of its crucial shortcomings. And Jefferson's presidency is like that too. He claimed to champion small government, but he enlarged federal power more than Washington or Adams ever did. He imagined an agrarian republic, but his policies led to increased manufacturing. He wanted to foster freedom, but he owned slaves and took land from the Indians. In the end, Jefferson's life and policies encapsulate the best and the worst of us, which is why his presidency is still worth studying closely. I'll see you next week.